This is going to be a very random sort of stream of consciousness video, not necessarily on any specific piece of media, although I did just finish watching Weapons, and I will be talking a little bit about that, but I'll try not to spoil that movie here because it's a great movie. You should go watch it. But again, this movie is not about weapons. I sat down trying to relax, thinking about the movie, and I see a video recommended to me uh, on YouTube about how in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, John Walker is more interesting of a character than Sam Wilson. And this is not a new take. This is a take that has been on the rise recently. The stocks for this take have been going up and up since Falcon and the Winter Soldier came out. And it was something that I found interesting at the time that I picked up on that I was like, I feel like the writers want me to hate John Walker, but he's actually not that bad of a guy. And then I noticed that channel seemed to be probably like a right-wing grifter. So I was like, I'm not going to watch this video. But it is a sentiment that I agree with. And that got me thinking on why that is. And so that got me thinking on why I thought that like Superman was a better movie than Fantastic Four. I reviewed Superman. I really liked that. I did not bother reviewing Fantastic Four because I didn't really have that much to say. And it's something else I've been tossing around quite a lot in my head, and something that I see discussed a lot, and I've been playing Baldur's Gate 3 again, is why the character in that game, Will, is often regarded as a very boring character. And I think a lot of these things are all very related, and it comes back to my favorite topic on this channel so far, my favorite piece of media, Code Geass. And I think it comes down to the importance of having flawed characters in your media. And so, where Weapons is concerned, this film spends a lot of time building up its characters. You explore a number of different characters in their personal lives, and you see the best of them and the worst of them. And so, you get to see them as real, genuine people, and you get to care about them and their personal stories, and as a result the whole town and the overall narrative I think you feel personally engaged with. And this is one reason I've never really liked most horror media, is I feel that they treat their characters as meat for the slaughter. And so to me there's no stakes in it because I don't enjoy just seeing characters killed off for fun. I'm not there rooting for the serial killer generally. I care when I care about the characters and I want them to make it out, right? And I'm invested in them and their stories. And I don't think a lot of horror movies do that. And the most effective ones do. And I think Weapons is an example of this. And the reason that I think John Walker is so likable is because he is so deeply flawed. He is a guy who does genuinely try his best and has done a lot of great things and tried to be the next Captain America. He tried to be the next Steve Rogers, but he failed. And he failed partially for reasons in his control. He failed partially because of, the serum fucked with his mind. And he failed partially because Sam and Bucky didn't fucking help him out. They told him to go fuck himself, right? And that is by itself kind of compelling. Everything was against this guy. And even after that, coming back in Thunderbolts, he tried to pull it, turn it all around, and he tried to once again be the best that he could. And to some extent, he succeeded. We'll see where that goes. But he's a really interesting, compelling character. Because of his flaws and because of his failures. And you compare that to Sam Wilson, where when he was originally introduced, he was a supporting character. And so it wasn't very important for him to have flaws. He just needed to be like a fun sidekick. And he was that. And he had some depth and he had some utility as a character that could fly, right? That was his purpose. And he was just kind of a good buddy for Sam, right? Or for Cap. For Steve. But as he made the transition into being a main character, I don't think they sufficiently built him up as a main character. And the challenge, I think, was that Steve was kind of unique in that Steve Rogers, his whole thing is that he does not really have flaws. The only flaw and the only thing you can say bad about Steve is that he's self-righteous. And he is, and that gets him into trouble sometimes, but he is ultimately always correct. Or at least, as far as the audience is concerned, as long as like any reasonable person is concerned, he is just uniquely correct, uniquely good. That's his thing. That's his shtick. No one can live up to it. And he said he sees that in Sam, but Sam narratively can't be the same thing because that would be boring and that would it would be literally be copy and paste. He cannot literally be the same thing as Steve was. And he's not the same thing that Steve was. He is different, and they make a point of that, but he's not really different in interesting ways in terms of how he like functions and fights. Really interesting. The wingsuit, all that, really cool. But there's no interesting flaws to latch onto. There's a part in Captain America 4 Brave New World where he's talking to his Falcon at the end of the movie, and his Falcon is saying, I fucked up, I feel bad, you've never fucked up. And Sam could have said at that time, what are you talking about? I fuck up all the time. Because he has fucked up. There have been times where he failed, right? He didn't, that's not what he said. I can't remember exactly what he said, but that is not what he said, okay? And I feel like that is part of the problem. And the reason that I think this is important and how this relates to some other things I've been thinking about and with Baldur's Gate and Will from that game is that I think there is a unique challenge that some writers have, and it could be coincidental here, but I think some writers are scared to write women and minority characters as being flawed, because they are afraid of creating stereotypes or creating poor representation of these groups, especially if they themselves are not part of that group. I don't know who wrote, these things. I don't know how many black writers were in the room for writing Captain America 4 or for writing Will in Baldur's Gate. But I suspect probably not as many as you'd think, right? And so I think there is probably an issue there with a fear of creating stereotypes or creating poor representation. And this also probably has historically led to the creation of the opposite, Mary Sue's and women, like strong women, the strong woman stereotype that some people and a lot of audiences too really, really just don't care for. Because when you go out of your way to create a character who is not flawed, you create a character who is impossible to relate to, right? Who is so difficult to to root for. And especially when you write them in such a way that other people like constantly celebrate them, XYZ. And again, Steve Rogers in the MCU is this wild exception to all of this. It's black magic. It's witchcraft what they did with Steve Rogers in the MCU. It truly is, because even Captain America in the comics is not like this. I mean, it is black magic what they pulled off, but they did it. Okay. But with Will in Baldur's Gate, in early access, he was meant to be a lot more of a flawed character, where he had actually he was much more of a petty, juvenile, selfish person who probably did just make a deal with the devil for his own selfish gain. But in the game that we got, he made a deal with the devil out of purely selfless intent. And throughout the entire game, no matter what you do, he is just exactly the paragon of virtue that he displays himself as, and that everybody thinks that he is the entire fucking time. And there's nothing you can do, and there's nothing he can do to really change that. Even if you try to be evil, the thing you can make him do that is evil does not affect his arc if he sticks around. And if you cross his personal line, he just disappears from the plot, right? And the result is that he's a really boring character. And you compare that to Minthara, who is perhaps the most popular companion in the game, or one of, who is an incredibly flawed character because she's just evil. She's such an evil bitch. But she is hilarious and she is compelling because of how well written she is. And I think the fact that she is this fantasy race gave them a lot of freedom in how they wrote Minthara. I feel like if Minthara was, for instance, a black woman, I'm not sure they would have written her the way that they did, right? But because she's some fantasy race, they had the freedom to write her however they want. And I think this is relating, we're getting into Mass Effect now. I think this is why routinely in Mass Effect, all of the alien characters are way more interesting than the human characters. The human characters in Mass Effect are always the most interesting characters. The alien characters are. The human characters are always the most boring. And I think part of this is that when you are writing something that is not human and is not necessarily bound to any preconceptions the writer might have or that the audience might have, and you are not fearful of any stereotypes or prejudices that you may have to consider, you have a lot more freedom in what you're writing. And so you create, you can create, you don't necessarily, but you can create way more compelling storylines. And so you consider Mass Effect 2, right? Where you have two characters, there's probably more if I think about it, but at least two characters with daddy issues, right? Um, One has a son issue, but I'll work with this analogy. You've got Thane and his son, right? These Drell, an alien species, a father who needs to reconnect with his estranged son because the father has done some fucked up shit, and the son is about to follow in his footsteps and do some fucked up shit. Okay, and you need to help stop that. That's the plot. That's the personal quest. And Thane is considered one of the most pop. I mean, it's hard. Thane is one of the. He's a beloved character. You can't start ranking Mass Effect characters. You'll be here all day. He's a beloved character in Mass Effect. Okay, and then similarly, you have Jacob Taylor, a character who his personal quest is to find his father, who has been technically missing, but for the analogy again, estranged. His father has been doing some fucked up shit, and you need to go stop his father from doing some fucked up shit. Jacob's not really in any danger of following in the footsteps, but you need to kind of decide on how to handle this, right? But Jacob is not an alien. Jacob is a human, and he's a black man. He's a black male human, okay? Thane is one of the most beloved characters in Mass Effect. Jacob Taylor is universally the most hated companion in Mass Effect. And also, somehow, either intentionally or unintentionally, one of the worst black stereotypes in like any gaming media ever. This is a black man with daddy issues who cheats on you, right? And is also just like boring and uninteresting aside as just a person and a character, and is useless in gameplay. Right? They fucked this guy up so bad. It's remarkable. I don't know how they did this, right? And I feel like I don't know how Jacob came to be, if it was intentional or an accident or what. But I feel like ever since that happened, I have personally felt, and maybe I'm just creating realities that don't exist here. I feel like Larian looked at Jacob Taylor and said, "We cannot possibly make the same mistake. So we will annihilate all of the flaws from Will as a character, and we will just make him a paragon of virtue and goodness, right? That everybody loves and celebrates, And so he will be boring, but he will not be a negative stereotype or a bad representation of this racial group." And I feel like that is a shitty choice, right? That is a weak, cowardly choice because you create someone who is not interesting. Um, and I think that is a flaw that a lot of media falls into, and that is probably what's happened with Sam Wilson, where I think they might be afraid to give Sam real flaws and problems and to make him a genuinely good character. And, the overall quality of writing in the movies have not been great recently. But we come not full circle, but, continuing to talk about the MCU, there has actually recently been an incredibly interesting, well written, deeply flawed black character in the MCU. Her name is Riri Williams. And I think Ryan Coogler was only like an executive producer, so his involvement may have been tangential. But we know Ryan Coogler is a black writer, director, producer who is deeply tapped into that culture and that world and that experience, and that comes through in everything that he is involved in. And so I don't think he was afraid to create a piece of media that portrays that culture realistically, and can create a real person, without having to be afraid of creating some kind of negative stereotype. He doesn't have to be afraid of being a white guy in a room. I think like the original writer Riri Williams might have been some white guy in a room writing about a black teenage girl who thinks she's going to be the next Tony Stark, right? And then ends up making one of the most hated characters in comics. Okay, he doesn't have to worry about that. And the result is he creates one of the most interesting characters in the MCU. Okay, I find that interesting, right? The fact that she is so deeply flawed and so interesting as a result. And even thinking about other things that I've consumed recently, Companion. I thought that movie was way more interesting when I thought that all the characters involved were um, flawed but realistic people. And then when I realized it was just like, oh, this character is just the good person and this character is just the villain, I became less interested, right? Because it became black and white. And so naturally, coming back to my favorite piece of media, what I love about Code Geass is the fact that everybody in that series, all the major characters, are just such deeply flawed and compelling people. Um, and coming back to Fantastic Four and why I didn't find it so interesting, I just didn't think like any of the characters were that complex or interesting. They they presented all of the characters in such unambiguously positive light. They hint that there is darkness in Reed, but we don't really see it. They don't challenge the audience. They don't challenge Reed. They don't challenge Pedro Pascal, who I still never liked them casting. They don't challenge Vanessa Kirby and Sue Storm. They put both of those characters into positions where they could have made some really interesting, dark decisions or been forced to, but the writing and the plot did not force them to, right? They always got to make easy, decisions that never challenged them, right? And I don't think Johnny and Ben got that much. Ben really got no screen time, and Johnny had plot significance to do, but I think Johnny is the character people are talking about the most in that he's known to be a womanizer, and that's something that's controversial in today's age. But in this movie, his whole thing is that he was so deeply empathetic to this character. The two women he gets to interact with are his sister and the naked space lady. And he's so deeply empathetic to the naked space lady that he fucking learns her whole language in like a week, right? That's his plot. And they suggest very lightly that he might be a womanizer, but you don't see it. You don't ever explore any of the bad of these characters. And so you come back to why John Walker's so interesting. You come back to weapons. You see the worst of all these characters. You never see the worst of any of these fucking characters in the Fantastic Four. You never see them as three-dimensional people. They're just boring. Even in Superman, I mean, one of the opening complaints about or not opening, but one of the most common complaints about Superman for the past 20 years has been, he's invincible and he's a Boy Scout. Okay. Well, guess what? James Gunn's Superman opens with him getting his ass beat, his first loss. There you go. He's not invincible. He can lose. We'll get that out of the way early. Next early scene, people are calling him out for, he is a Boy Scout, but people are calling him out. They're criticizing his morality. They're criticizing his actions. Lois Lane is comparing what he did to torture, and he's like, well, I didn't really torture the guy. It wasn't a really sharp cactus, right? And he gets a little upset about it. He's getting mad about it. He's losing his temper, right? So you're seeing complexity in his character, right? He is ultimately a Boy Scout, but you see the complexity, and you get to see him suffer. He's in some dark places. You get to see him suffer. You get to see him upset. You get to see him mad, right? It's compelling. You don't get any of this shit in Fantastic Four. I mean, the most stress the characters are under is when Sue's giving birth. I don't. Shit's boring, dude. And I've been playing a lot of games too. It's a similar thing with games, where morality and the choices you can make in games are only as interesting as the choices that you don't make. So, like in Baldur's Gate, one of my complaints with that game is that I feel that there's no compelling reason to be evil. I don't think the game really does a good job of justifying being evil, right? Being evil is just, you can be evil for the sake of being evil. But there's no compelling reasons to do it. And so to the same extent, there's no compelling reasons to be good. The most compelling games and the most compelling stories are the ones where it is not simple and it is not easy and it is not even necessarily always correct to be good. And overall, I think Baldur's Gate fails at this, but there are a few moments in Baldur's Gate that are good at this. So the first time I played Baldur's Gate 3, I didn't know that much about 5th edition or about Baldur's Gate lore. So I didn't know anything about Vlaakith. I didn't know anything about the Githyanki. I didn't know anything about the Emperor. I didn't know anything about the story. So when I confront Vlaakith and she's saying, you're being lied to, the person in the prison is manipulating you, I was conflicted, because I was pretty sure the person in the prison was lying to me and manipulating me. But at the same time, I didn't trust her either. So I felt there were compelling decisions to make. Same thing with Shar. I didn't know anything about Shar. I didn't know if I should support Shadowheart's worship of Shar or support this other fucking bitch over here. I didn't know. And I thought there was complexity there, and that was interesting. But then when I find out, no, Vlaakith's just evil, Shar's just evil, like, these are just the bad decisions. There's really no reason you would do any of this shit, right? It becomes a lot less compelling. But there are some scenarios in the game, like rescuing people from that prison, where doing the right thing in that situation, that shit's kind of hard, right? That's interesting. There's a few moments in Mass Effect that are similar, where in general, Paragon is the correct decision in Mass Effect, but there are a few small moments where Renegade is the correct decision, where you actually have to make a sacrifice for the greater good. And those are interesting, compelling choices. And I feel like recently there just really has not been a lot of that. You will never see a character making a sacrifice for the greater good in any kind of media, because I think writers are scared of that. Hollywood's scared of that. The audiences might be scared of that. And that's really fucking boring and shitty. I'm not saying there's no room for purely optimistic, perfect ending, golden ending kind of stuff, but you got to have some complexity. You got to have some darkness. You got to have some flaws, right? You got to have some flawed characters at the very least. Even if we get to the golden ending at the end of the road, you got to make it interesting on the way there. But the way that things are right now, man, especially with where we're going, Spider-Man's the next movie for the MCU, and then we got Doomsday. I don't know how Doomsday is going to work. They have 2.5 hours to introduce Doom. I'm not going to start ranting about the MCU, but where we are right now, I don't know. I just wanted to get these thoughts out of my head, because these are some interesting thoughts that I've had rolling around for a while, some random thoughts, and they all kind of coalesced with this movie I saw, then this video I saw about the importance of having flawed characters in media. So, I hope you enjoyed, and thanks for listening to me ramble.